Thanks, Tom. Okay, hello everyone. Well, thank you so much for coming. It's great to be here. So as I said, I'm John Dawson, come up from Southampton. And this is part of a whole week of events that the Christian Union put on, we're calling Story. And really, our whole motivation for doing this week is to give you guys the opportunity to explore the Christian story for yourself. We call this story gospel. Gospel literally means good news. And it's good because it shows us that behind everything, ultimate reality, is a God who is love. And if that's true, it changes everything. We're not here as the result of some great big accident that threw us into being. We're not here on the whim of an omnipotent deity who made us with a flex of his muscles just because he can, but we're here out of the overflowing generosity of a God of love. And if that's true, it means life's not just about surviving long enough to pass in your genes. It's not just about passing some great big moral exam. It's about living out our potential as people made to know this God who knows and loves each one of us. And it's a really life-affirming and dignifying message. So that's why we're here, that's what we're doing. And yet we're very aware that there's all kinds of really fundamental objections and concerns and suspicions about this message, very significant questions. And so what we're trying to do in these lunchtime talks is really to try and address some of these concerns and objections head on. And the big question we're looking at today is this question of science. Has science made belief in God redundant, irrelevant, and that kind of thing? So, as I said, I'm John. I've come up from Southampton. I'm a research scientist there, exploring the very interesting area of regenerative medicine. But I'm here in a personal capacity today on the invitation of the Christian Union to talk about one of my favourite topics. I love thinking about this issue, and it's very important to me. We're going to have some time for questions at the end for you to feedback your questions. But as I said, the question today is, has science rendered belief in God redundant, irrelevant? So that's the question we're thinking about. It's a very prominent and significant question. First slide, please. This chap here, Peter Atkins, is Professor of Chemistry at Oxford. And he talks about the relationship between science and religion. He says this: science, the system of belief founded securely on publicly shared, reproducible knowledge, emerged from religion. And as science discarded its chrysalis to become its present butterfly, it took over the heath. So for Atkins, religion had a role to play in our kind of intellectual development as human beings, but that role has now been thoroughly superseded by the power of science. And like a butterfly emerging from a restrictive chrysalis, because of the power of science, we've been able to spread our wings like the enlightened butterflies that we are. He goes on to say that there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Only the religious, among whom I include not only the prejudiced but the uninformed, hope there is a dark corner of the physical universe or of the universe of experience that science can never hope to illuminate. So there's two claims there. I don't know if you noticed. There's two claims. The first claim is that science is exclusive. It has this unique ability to give us publicly shared, reproducible knowledge about the world. Science is exclusive. It's unique in its ability to give us a reliable, truthful understanding of the world, ourselves, the universe, and everything. And the second claim is it's sufficient. Science is entirely sufficient to allow us to understand ourselves, the world, the universe, and everything. It can give us this fully orbed, complete understanding of the world that leaves no room for the religious type of explanations that involve God. And really, they're the two claims I'd like us to think about: the exclusivity of science and the sufficiency of science. Before we do that, let's do another quote. This is another great scientist, James Watson, who with Francis Crick discovered the double helical structure of DNA. And he talks about religious scientists like me. He says, occasionally I meet them and I'm a bit embarrassed because I cannot believe anyone who accepts truth by revelation. So obviously that hurts me a little bit. So part of the reason I'm here today is to justify my own existence as a scientist who's also a committed Christian. Now, let me tell you a bit more about my research area and one of the big breakthroughs in my research area. It came from this, and one other quote before we get on to that. So let me go back to what James Watson said. He's saying he's embarrassed, but actually one of the ways I take courage as a Christian is the fact that there are many other great Christians out there who are also scientists throughout the history of science right up until the present day. James Watson, of course, after discovering the double helical structure of DNA, commenced the Human Genome Project, this great project to map completely the human genome, the genetic code. His successor is this chap here, Francis Collins, who in 2003 was director of the Human Genome Project, which eventually saw the complete mapping of the human genome. And he says this, he says, "I had started this journey of intellectual exploration to confirm my atheism that now lay in ruins as I was forced to admit the plausibility of the God hypothesis." That's in his book, The Language of God, in which he tells his story of his own development as a scientist, but also his coming to accept the Christian faith for himself. So if nothing else, that should give us pause for thought, that it may not be quite as simple as people like Peter Atkins and James Watson would have us believe. It's perfectly possible to be immersed in the sciences and yet to discover the truth, the relevance, the reliability of the Christian faith. And that's really what I'd like us to explore. Okay, back to my research area. So this is one of the big breakthroughs in my field. This is by a Nobel Prize winner called Shinya Yamanaka, who discovered induced pluripotent stem cells. What are they? Why am I talking about them? Well, let's think what they are first of all. Stem cells are pluripotent because they have the potential to become all of the different cells that make up our body. When you're a little embryo, right at the beginning of your development, you are basically a ball of stem cells. Those cells couldn't do anything, but they had the potential to specialize into your brain cells, your bone cells, your skin cells. They had this pluripotential. Now, over the course of development, as you grow, that potential is very quickly lost as those cells specialize and become committed to forming the different cell types that make your body. Now, Shinya Yamanaka made this amazing discovery. He discovered that you could take an old skin cell or even an old bladder cell washed out in your wee, and you could grow them up in the lab and turn on a few key genes to kind of reset your cells to become stem cells again. That's what he's talking about, induced pluripotency. You can turn on the pluripotency of these cells. An amazing thing. So maybe one day you could wee into a pot. Some scientists could take the cells, they could grow them up, turn on a few key genes, and then specialize them into neurons to treat your Parkinson's or something like that. Very significant, very important discovery that he won the Nobel Prize for. And the way he demonstrated this was through a very important experiment. Next slide, please. He took some of his cells, this is from a mouse, some of these skin cells. He tinkered with them to turn them back into stem cells, and then what he did is he injected them into an embryo of another mouse. That's what you see him doing here. On the bottom right there are the cells. He's injecting them into a very early mouse embryo. Now, if they were just skin cells, those cells would die. They wouldn't do anything. But if he succeeded in turning them into stem cells, then those cells should fuse with that mouse embryo and go on to contribute to the development of that mouse. And that's what he saw. So he is able to generate this chimeric mouse, a mouse made up of two distinct genetic identities. Half the mouse was made from that original embryo, half the mouse was made from those cells he had growing in a petri dish a couple of months earlier. So it's a very, very powerful demonstration of an astonishing discovery. And it's exactly this that gives science such credibility in our culture. Richard Dawkins talks about this credibility on the next slide when he says this. He says, "Science boosts its claim to truth by a spectacular ability to make matter and energy jump through hoops on command and to predict what will happen and when." Science can change our world, understand our world like nothing else. And it's because of the power of science, because of the astonishing ability it has to understand and change our world, many people have said, well, you know what? Science is really the only really reliable way we have of knowing anything. And so what we've got to do is we've got to limit the type of explanations that we give to ourselves and the universe, only to what science can tell us. This is a very developed project. Daniel Dennett, who's a great advocate of this view, says this in a book he humbly entitled Consciousness Explained. He says this, he says, there is only one sort of stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. We can, in principle, we're not there yet, scientists are working on it, account for every mental phenomena using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials. Now, this project to explain everything there is to say about us, the universe, and everything only in terms of biology, chemistry, and physics is very developed, but it also leads to some very unlikely and counterintuitive explanations. This is James Watson's colleague on the next slide talking about you on this, using these biological mechanistic terms. He says this, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity, and free will are in fact no more, and that's the key phrase, no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So everything, these aspects of your personality, of who you are, according to this view, can be reduced down simply to cells signaling to one another. Now that seems inadequate, doesn't it? Here's someone else, Richard Dawkins, talking about love. He was asked by a Christian interviewer about love. He said this, when you think about your wife, what does love mean? Dawkins says, well, we've been into that before. It's an emotion which is a manifestation of brain stuff. Jesus said love is the purpose of life. Does that sound nonsense to you? Dawkins says, it sounds like something grafted on, a superfluous excrescence on life which I feel I understand better. But it doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. So for Dawkins, love is nothing more than a manifestation of brain stuff. And the sense that most of us have that love is of central significance to what it means to be a human being, that love lies right at the core of what it is to be human, is actually something we're imposing on reality, something we're grafting on which isn't really there. So to say that love is of central significance to being human is a story we're telling ourselves that's not true. Now, intuitively, that seems inadequate. Love seems of much deeper significance than simply being an emotion, a manifestation of brain stuff. Clearly it is an emotion, a manifestation of brain stuff, but the question is there more to say about it than that? And most of us, I think, would say that there is. Now, that's a soft argument against what Dawkins and Dennett are saying, but there's also a harder philosophical argument as well. And the clue to that comes in the last thing that Dawkins says. He says, just back one slide, it doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. So what are brains in this view? What are our brains for? Patricia Churchland, in the next slide, talks about the function of our brains, the function of our nervous systems. Boiled down to essentials, the principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. A fancier style of representing, so the ability to think and conceptualize and try and make sense of the world, is advantageous so long as it is geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chance of survival. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. So the reason we think, the reason we try and make sense of the world, the reason we do science is not ultimately in order to discover what's true, because that's not what our brains are for. Our brains ultimately are there in our heads to help us survive, and that is all. Now sometimes survival benefit and truth might align, but often not. A case in point would be religion in this view. Religion, in this view, has no truth benefit. Its function is merely a survival mechanism. It helps social cohesion and that kind of thing. Because ultimately, our brains aren't here to help us discover what's true. Our brains are in our heads to help us get our body parts where they need to be in order to survive. But you see the problem with saying that. If we can't trust our brains, then we can't trust our brains even when our brains tell us we can't trust our brains. Philosophically, it's a dead end. If it's true, it's false. So in order to understand our minds, we need to go beyond simply what biology tells us. Someone who recognizes this is another philosopher, a neuroscientist called Raymond Tallis, and he puts it very clearly. He says, this biologistic image, this attempt to explain ourselves only in terms of what biology can tell us, effectively denies the centrality, even the possibility of precisely those unique capacities that have made humans able to theorize about evolution or to develop neuroscience. And this is the key point. If Darwin's On the Origin of the Species were really the last word on humanity, the only thing to say about us, then it could not have been written. So this attempt to squeeze ourselves only into what biology, chemistry, and physics can tell us, this attempt to kind of censor out anything in our human story that's not validated by a biology experiment, ultimately means our human story becomes incoherent. It no longer makes sense. In order to understand ourselves, we need to go beyond what biology, chemistry, and physics can tell us. But that's a problem, isn't it? Because as we've already said, what is there beyond science that can give us reliable knowledge about ourselves, the world, and everything? Max Planck, he puts it clearly. He says, experiments are the only means of knowledge at our disposal. The rest is poetry, imagination. And Bertrand Russell, on the next slide, he says, whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. Now, there's a very obvious problem with what Bertrand Russell is saying here. Bertrand Russell's not a scientist, he is a philosopher. He is making a claim to knowledge, but it's a claim that he did not discover through scientific methods. He discovered it by sitting on his chair, smoking his pipe. He's saying, really, that we don't need to listen to him, so we're not going to. But what I want us to think about is the mistake that he's making, the underlying methodological mistake behind this way of thinking. Here's a quote from a rather fusty old philosophy of science textbook, but it makes the point well. It says this: if he be a man engaged in any important inquiry, you'll be pleased to know that women don't make this mistake. I'm not sure why. But he says, he must have a method, and he will be under a strong and constant temptation to make a metaphysics, almost like a religion, out of his method. That is, to suppose the universe ultimately of such a sort that his method must be appropriate and successful. It's a very basic mistake to make. It's a mistake that actually my daughter had learned not to make by the time she was about 1 year old. This is a picture of my daughter. At this age, when she was maybe 9 or 10 months, I could be playing with my phone in front of her like a good father, and obviously she'd want to play with my phone. But it was enough at that age for me to simply put my phone away in my pocket, and she'd forget about my phone and move on to wanting something else she couldn't have. But a few months later, that no longer worked. She'd realized something about the world. She'd realized that just because she couldn't see my phone didn't mean it wasn't available for her to play with. She just needed to use a different method to get access to my phone. And scientists know this. They have to learn this very early on. It's no good saying, I've got this really great assay. It always gives me reliable results. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to limit my understanding of my subject area only into what I can find out using this particular assay. An astronomer doesn't look through her telescope and say, well, you know, my telescope can only see so far, so I'm going to squeeze my understanding of the galaxies only into what I can see through my telescope. Now, scientists know they've got to go and find new ways of seeing further. They ask a very important type of question, the hypothetical question. They ask, what if? What if there's more out there to discover? How will I go about getting access to it? So let's, as we finish, think about this question of purpose that I've mentioned a few times. What if there is a purpose to this universe? What if that purpose is love, like with the Christian message says? How would we discover that? Here's a helpful idea by another philosopher called Leslie Newbigin. He says this: cause can be discovered by science, but purpose cannot, because until the purpose has been realized, it is hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. Newbigin recognizes that purpose is something that persons have. Persons who can look forward into the future and form desires and take steps to achieve those desires. That's what purpose is. And as such, it's hidden. Until that purpose is realized, it's hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. He gives an illustration of a building site. Imagine you're walking along, you come across some bricks stacked up here and there, some tools lying around, and you decide that there's a purpose to what's going on here. How do you discover what that purpose is? Well, Newbigin says you've got two choices. You can go back every day and take the kind of empirical approach and see what emerges up out of the rubble, or you can go and talk to the architect, the one whose purpose it is, and ask him to reveal it to you. And Newbigin says, when it comes to discovering the purpose of our lives, the purpose of the universe, waiting around until the end, that's not an option. If we're to discover why we're here and what we're for, then the one whose purpose it is needs to make it known. At the heart of Christianity is a very remarkable claim that God, the one whose purpose it is, has made not just his purpose, but his very self accessible, knowable to us. The beginning of one of the accounts of Jesus' life are these very famous words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. That word is this Greek term logos. It's this idea the Greeks had that behind everything there was this kind of inherent rationality, a way of making sense, of harmonizing life, the universe, and everything. And John takes this word and he does something very interesting. The first thing he does is he personalizes it. He says he was in the beginning with God. And then he goes a step further. In the few verses later, he says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. It's this claim. In Jesus Christ, God himself has made himself accessible to us. Ultimately, the reason science is so successful, so powerful, is not, I think, just because of the ingenuity of its methods, nor because of the rigors of peer review and all of that kind of stuff. Ultimately, it's because of the accessibility of its subject matter. Science deals with the stuff you can get your hands on, the stuff you can prod and poke and manipulate and control. And when science advances, it's because new techniques, new ways of thinking have come along that have made a whole new swathes of reality accessible to us. At the heart of Christianity is this claim that God himself has made himself accessible to us. He's made himself accessible, first of all, to our scrutiny. In the person of Jesus, God entered into this world. He impacted people's lives in history. He's left his footprint in history. And that's a claim you can scrutinize. It's a claim you can investigate. You can't investigate a lofty philosophy, even the lofty philosophy of materialism that we saw earlier. You can't investigate a private revelation in a cave or a mystical experience, but this claim is something you can investigate, you can scrutinize. He's made himself accessible to our scrutiny, but more than that, he's made himself accessible to people like you and me. The claim of Christianity is that ultimate reality, God, is not someone that you need to be a great scientist or a great philosopher to encounter, because this is someone you get to know through a personal relationship. Now, I'm a scientist. We're not people. The idea that ultimate reality is not something, but someone, might make you feel a bit uncomfortable. We prefer dissecting things, not talking to them. But you see, to shut yourself off from that idea and say, I'm only going to believe in something you can do an experiment to me to prove, is ultimately to decide the answer even before you've begun the investigation. It's an attempt to tell the universe how it should be. It's not, in other words, very scientific. I'm going to finish with that thought, but I'm sure there's loads and loads of questions.